The night before my 24th birthday, my father's words cut through me like a blade. Not a single person in this family will come to your birthday. I spent hours telling myself it couldn't be true, that surely they would remember. But the next day, as I sat at a long table set for 10 with candles burning down in silence, my phone lit up with photos of them smiling in Disneyland, the so-called happiest place on earth. My name is Emily Carter, and that was the moment I understood that the cruelest betrayals don't come from strangers, but from the family who chooses joy without you. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The air inside our small New Jersey apartment felt heavier than usual that night, as if the humid end-of-May heat had seeped through the walls and settled on my skin. The only light came from the yellow lamp in the living room, casting long shadows over the decorations I had carefully put up. Blue balloons clung to the walls, with tape drooping slightly in the sticky air. On the table sat a small birthday cake I'd picked up from the bakery down the street, its frosting already beginning to glisten. 10 sets of plates and silverware lined the table, each one placed neatly, as if that might somehow convince my family to fill the seats. I stood back for a moment, staring at the room. I wanted it to look welcoming, warm, something that might soften my father's expression or make my mother linger for once. Hanging on the closet door across the room was my navy blue graduation gown, the one I'd worn just a few weeks earlier when I walked across the stage at NYU Stern. I had left it out on purpose, like a silent reminder that I wasn't just a shadow in this family, that I had achieved something that deserved to be seen. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer. Maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe they'll finally show up. The sound of the door creaking open cut my thought in half. My father stepped inside, the leather of his shoes clicking against the wooden floor. Richard Carter, 55. Manager at the local bank, still wearing his work tie loosened around his neck. His posture was tired, but his eyes were sharp, distant, the kind that never softened when they landed on me. He didn't even glance at the cake or the balloons or the effort I had poured into every detail. He just dropped into the armchair with a sigh that felt heavier than the heat. "Emily," he said, voice flat, almost casual, "don't expect anything tomorrow. Not a single person in this family will come to your birthday." The words hit me harder than if he had shouted. I froze where I stood, my hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly the wood pressed into my palms. You're kidding, right?" My voice cracked, a thin attempt at a laugh slipping out. "Dad, I already reserved the table. I got the cake, the decorations." But he didn't laugh. He didn't even look at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, like the grain of the wood mattered more than his daughter. Behind him, the door frame filled with another presence. My mother Margaret, arms crossed tightly over her chest, lips pressed into a line. She didn't say a word, but the quick flick of her eyes toward him said enough. Agreement. Endorsement. A quiet signal that his words were hers, too. The glow of a phone screen lit up the far side of the couch. Sophie, my 21-year-old sister, sprawled across the cushions like a queen in her castle, perfectly manicured nails tapping across her TikTok feed. She didn't even bother to look up when she chimed in. "Who even cares about birthdays anymore?" she muttered, smirking as her thumb flicked across the glass. "Seriously, Emily, you're too old for this." The smirk twisted in her tone, sharp and deliberate, and I felt it lodge inside me like a splinter. I looked from one to the other, desperate for a crack, for some sign that this was a cruel joke, and not the truth. Mom. Dad. This is my 24th birthday. I thought maybe this year. My throat closed before I could finish. I had been hoping so naively that maybe this year would be different, that maybe the empty chairs at every celebration before had been mistakes, not patterns. My father shifted in his seat, his tie brushing against his chest as he leaned back. "It's not about you, Emily. We have other plans. Don't make this dramatic. Other plans." The words tasted bitter in my mouth. I turned to my mother, searching her face for something, anything, that might contradict him. But her eyes were cold, unreadable, and a moment later she pushed herself off the doorframe and walked down the hall without a word. The silence she left behind was filled with the sound of Sophie's laugh, short and sharp, as she scrolled past something on her phone. I wanted to scream, to beg, to demand that they see me. Instead, I stood there, the heat of humiliation crawling up my neck. "Fine," I whispered, though the word trembled. My father didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge I had spoken. He rose from the chair with a grunt, walked past me without a glance, and disappeared down the hallway. I was left with Sophie's smirk and the soft hum of her scrolling. My eyes drifted back to the table, to the cake I had carefully chosen with its simple white frosting and blue lettering. "Happy birthday, Emily." The candles I had placed in the center flickered under the fan's breath, their tiny flames defiant in the thick air. For the first time, they looked absurd, almost mocking, like little reminders that I had planned for people who would never come. I sank into one of the empty chairs, staring at the glow of those candles. And in the silence of the room, I felt the weight of every birthday before pressing down on me. The ache was sharp, raw, and familiar. The cake sat there, perfect and untouched, and I realized how cruel hope could be when it kept leading you back to the same empty table. I folded my arms on the surface, laid my head down against the cool wood, and let the silence swallow me whole. The balloons rustled faintly in the corner. Sophie's laugh floated down the hall. The candles flickered again, and for the first time that night I stopped wondering if tomorrow would be different. I already knew the answer. The small Italian restaurant smelled of roasted garlic and warm bread, the kind of scent that usually made me feel safe like home. But that afternoon it only clung to me like a cruel reminder of everything I didn't have. A banner with "Happy Birthday, Emily" scrawled in silver letters hung crookedly above the table I'd reserved, a table pressed up against the window, where sunlight spilled across 10 empty chairs. Blue balloons bobbed gently in the draft from the air conditioning. I smoothed the skirt of my cobalt dress and tried to sit tall, pretending this wasn't as pathetic as it looked. My phone lay face down on the table. I'd placed it that way on purpose, as if ignoring it could keep me from checking the time every other minute. 30 minutes passed. A waiter in a crisp white shirt approached with a hesitant smile. "Would you like to order something while you wait, miss?" His accent softened the words, but I heard the pity behind them. "I'll wait," I said quickly, forcing a smile that felt brittle. My voice cracked on the last word. He nodded and left, but I could feel his eyes lingering a second too long, the way people do when they recognize sadness but don't know what to do with it. From a nearby table, a couple leaned close to each other, whispering. The woman's eyes flicked toward me before she turned her head, lips curving with a kind of sympathy that stung worse than judgment. I caught a piece of their murmur. She must have been stood up. Heat rushed into my face, and I grabbed my water glass, taking a sip to hide the way my hand trembled. The condensation slid across my palm, making my grip slippery. I stared at the ice cubes bobbing against the glass as if they might anchor me to something solid. The whispers spread like static through the restaurant. Or maybe it was just in my head, magnified by the silence at my table, by the 10 chairs that screamed louder than any words. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste metal. My phone buzzed, vibrating against the wood. I hesitated, my pulse quickening, then flipped it over. The screen lit with a new Instagram notification. I tapped it open and my breath caught. There they were. My father reclining in a lounge chair, a beer bottle raised casually in his hand. My mother wearing oversized sunglasses, smiling wide, and Sophie center of the frame, her hair falling in waves over a pink sundress, holding a tall glass of neon pink cocktail like she was on the cover of a magazine. Behind them, the glittering castle of Disneyland towered in the background, blue spires piercing a perfect California sky. The caption glowed beneath the image family trip, "Happiest place on earth." My throat tightened until it hurt. The happiest place on earth, and I wasn't even worth a seat at their table. The waiter returned, pushing a small cart with a cake perched on top. A round chocolate one simple frosting with happy birthday. Emily piped in neat cursive. He set it carefully in front of me and lit the candles, his hands quick practiced. "Would you like us to sing?" he asked softly, like he already knew the answer. "No," I whispered. My voice broke on the single syllable. He nodded, gave a small sympathetic smile, and stepped away, leaving me with the glow of tiny flames flickering in the bright afternoon light. I stared at the candles. They wavered, stubborn, alive, as if mocking the emptiness around me. My reflection shimmered faintly in the window pane behind them, and I hated the girl I saw. Sitting alone in a dress too formal for the occasion, surrounded by reminders of a family who had chosen to erase me. My chest ached with something sharp and relentless. I pressed my lips together, holding it in, refusing to let the tears fall. Not here, not in front of strangers. I took the knife, cut a small slice of cake, and placed it on the plate in front of me. The chocolate smelled sweet, almost too sweet. I picked up my fork, pushed it into the frosting, and put the bite in my mouth. It tasted like cardboard. A couple walked past my table on their way out. The man glanced at me, then quickly looked away. The woman smiled sadly, whispering happy birthday as if I were a child who had dropped her ice cream. I muttered a thank you, my voice so faint I wasn't sure they even heard. I forced down another bite of cake. The sugar coated my tongue, but the bitterness in my chest drowned it out. My hands shook as I set the fork down. The candles flickered lower wax, dripping down their sides. I leaned closer, resting my chin on my hand, and for a moment I wanted to blow them out to make a wish like I used to when I was a little girl. But the thought of wishing for a family who had already chosen against me felt cruel, like begging a locked door to open when I knew the key didn't exist. I sat back, staring at the empty chairs, the untouched plates. My voice inside my head was steady, harder than I expected. This is what it is. They made their choice. The waiter returned to clear another table, glancing at me with the kind of gentleness I couldn't bear. I straightened in my chair, lifted my water, and sipped again, pretending my composure hadn't already crumbled. The laughter from another corner of the restaurant echoed across the tiled floor. A group of friends clinked glasses, their celebration spilling into the air. I closed my eyes, let the sound wash over me like static, and imagined it belonged to me. When I opened them, the candles on my cake had burned down to stubs, wax hardened against the icing. I pushed the plate away. I pressed my lips together, biting back the burn in my throat, and whispered inside myself like a vow. This birthday is empty, but it will not define me. It will not swallow me whole. I folded my napkin, placed it neatly on the table, and stood. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, turning a few heads, but I didn't care. I walked past the banner, past the balloons, past the table that should have been filled with the people who were supposed to love me. When I stepped outside, the warm air wrapped around me thick and heavy, but at least it was honest. I lifted my chin, squared my shoulders, and began the walk back home. When I finally made it back to my apartment, the silence inside pressed down on me even harder than the air outside the restaurant. I set my purse on the counter, slipped off my heels, and collapsed into the couch. The half-deflated balloons from the night before sagged in the corner, one of them squeaking faintly as it rubbed against the wall. I stared at them for a long time, my throat aching, and all at once memories I had tried to bury began clawing their way to the surface. I was 10 years old again, standing in the kitchen of our old house in Newark. I had begged my parents for a birthday party with a few friends from school, nothing big, just pizza and cake. Instead, my mother handed me a single cupcake from the grocery store, the kind wrapped in plastic, the frosting smudged on top. "Happy birthday, kiddo," she said distractedly, already reaching for her purse. "We need to run to ShopRite before it gets crowded." My father jingled the car keys, impatient. The front door shut behind them, and I sat at the kitchen table with the cupcake in front of me, the candle I had stuck into it flickering weakly. No friends, no laughter, just the ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I blew out the candle and whispered a wish I can't even remember now. Fast forward 8 years. Sophie turned 18, and the whole neighborhood seemed to show up. Balloons lined the backyard. Fairy lights sparkled overhead, and the bass from the rented speakers rattled the windows. I stood near the fence holding a flimsy paper plate with a melting slice of cake as I watched my parents present her with the latest iPhone wrapped in a silver bow. The crowd erupted in cheers. Sophie squealed, throwing her arms around our father's neck. My mother took dozens of photos, posting them all over Facebook with captions like, "Our shining star." I lingered on the edge of it all, invisible, while the flashes from the camera washed over her glowing face. No one even noticed when I slipped back into the house. Another memory intruded sharper than the rest. I was 17, sitting at my desk, hands shaking as I tore open the thick envelope stamped with the NYU crest. I skimmed the words, my heart racing. Full scholarship. 4 years completely covered. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping, waving the letter in my father's face as he sat at the kitchen table with a crossword puzzle. "Dad. Look, I did it. I got a full ride." 4 years. He glanced at the page for less than 2 seconds before turning back to his pen. "Good," he muttered. "That's less money for us to worry about." His pen scratched across the box of a 7-letter word while my joy collapsed into silence. I folded the letter carefully as if protecting it could make up for the fact that no one else seemed to care. Then there was the summer at 15 when I fell during soccer practice. The pain shot up my arm, my elbow swelling purple within minutes. My coach called my mother, who arrived half an hour later. She frowned, sighed, and said, "You're strong, Emily. Don't make such a fuss. Ice it and you'll be fine." I cradled my arm, biting back tears, while she wandered off to chat with another parent about their upcoming vacation. The following year, Sophie tripped at the park and scraped her knee. Barely a scratch, just a thin line of blood. My mother screamed like she'd been shot, scooping her up and racing to the ER. When they came home, Sophie lay on the couch with her leg wrapped in gauze, spooning ice cream from the carton, while my mother stroked her hair and whispered, "My poor baby. You scared me to death." The ache in my chest deepened as those scenes replayed, colliding into one another until they blurred. Each one was another stitch in the same fabric, a tapestry of favoritism so blatant, I wondered how I'd convinced myself for so long that it might change. I shifted on the couch, pulling my knees to my chest. The glow from the lamp caught the corner of the graduation gown hanging in my closet. I remembered how it had felt walking across that stage alone, and how even that triumph had felt hollow without them. Sophie had always been the center, the one held up as precious, fragile, deserving of everything. I had been the strong one, the invisible one, the one expected to endure quietly. I used to tell myself it didn't matter that it made me independent. But sitting there staring at the sagging balloons from my failed birthday, I finally admitted the truth. I had been starving for their approval my entire life. The tears finally came hot and steady, running down my face, until I buried it in my hands. I hated myself for crying, hated giving them that power, but I couldn't stop. When the sobs eased, I pulled in a shaky breath and let my hands fall to my lap. I stared at the floor until my vision cleared. In the silence, I whispered, almost as if I were speaking to that 10-year-old girl with the cupcake, or the 17-year-old with the scholarship letter, or the 15-year-old with the swollen elbow. You were never less. You just weren't chosen. The room stayed quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I leaned back against the couch, eyes on the balloons that drifted aimlessly in the corner, and for the first time I admitted something to myself that I had never dared to say out loud from the very beginning. I had never been allowed to stand beside my sister. We had never been equals, not once. The apartment was darker than usual, the only light coming from the small lamp on the counter and the faint glow of my phone screen. The cake from the restaurant sat untouched on the coffee table, the frosting already drying at the edges. The balloons I had dragged home earlier leaned weakly in the corner, sagging like they had given up on pretending. I wrapped my arms around myself and sat in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint patter of rain against the window. A knock broke through the stillness. 3 soft taps, hesitant but steady. I wiped quickly at my face and opened the door. David stood there with a pizza box balanced in one hand and a bouquet of sunflowers in the other. The flowers were bright golden, unapologetically alive, their petals dripping with raindrops. He smiled gently. "Happy birthday, Em. You deserve someone here." My chest tightened. For a moment, I didn't trust myself to speak. I stepped aside, and he came in shaking the rain from his jacket before setting the pizza on the counter. The scent of melted cheese and garlic filled the air, warmer, more comforting than anything I had felt all day. "I figured you hadn't eaten," he said, placing the sunflowers in an empty vase I had forgotten to fill. "So I brought backup." I forced a small laugh. "You know me too well." He opened the pizza box, pulled out a slice, and set it in front of me. Then he reached for a knife and cut a piece of the cake still sitting on the table. "And this," he said, "we're not letting it go to waste." Before I could respond, another knock came at the door. This one louder, more rushed. I frowned, crossing the room. When I opened it, 2 of my co-workers, Leah and Mark, stood there holding a small gift bag and a bottle of cheap wine. "Sorry we're late," Leah said breathlessly, brushing wet hair from her face. "We wanted to stop by. You didn't think we'd forget, did you?" For a moment I couldn't move. Then the smile came unsteady but real. "Come in," I said softly. They stepped inside, shaking off umbrellas, their energy filling the apartment in a way that made it feel less hollow. Leah handed me the bag. Inside was a notebook with a leather cover, the kind she knew I liked to carry for ideas. "It's not much," she said, "but you always have a pen in your hand. Thought you could use a new one." "Thank you," I whispered, my throat thick. David cleared his throat, his eyes twinkling. "Well, now that the gang's here." He set the small cake back in front of me and lit the remaining candles. "Let's try this again." We crowded around the table. Leah and Mark started singing off-key, but enthusiastic. David joined in, his voice low and warm. Their laughter carried through the tiny apartment, bouncing against the walls that had felt so suffocating just an hour earlier. I closed my eyes as the candles flickered in front of me, the same candles that had burned down to stubs in the restaurant. This time I let myself take a breath, let myself make a wish, even though I knew better than to expect magic. I blew them out, the smoke curling upward into the dim light. Finally Mark said, clapping, "Now we can eat." The pizza was greasy, the wine cheap, the cake already stale, but as we sat on the couch together, plates balanced on our laps, I realized it was the best meal I'd had in a long time. They told stories from work, complained about our boss, teased me about being another year older. I laughed when they laughed, though. My eyes kept drifting to the phone on the table. The photo of Disneyland still burned behind my eyelids. My father with his beer, my mother's sunglasses, Sophie's cocktail, and her triumphant smile. They looked so carefree, so proud to be together without me. I turned the phone face down. David noticed his hand brushing mine. He didn't say anything, just gave me a look that said he understood. The night carried on with chatter and laughter. Eventually, Leah and Mark hugged me goodbye, promising brunch soon, leaving me with a messy table and crumbs on the carpet. David stayed, helping me clear the plates. When the last dish was stacked in the sink, he leaned against the counter, studying me. "You okay?" I nodded too quickly. "I'm fine." His voice was quiet but steady. "You don't have to pretend." My eyes darted to the window where the rain streaked down in uneven lines. I took a breath, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't press. He just stepped closer, wrapping his arms around me. For a moment I let my head fall against his shoulder, letting myself be held, letting the silence stretch. Later, when he left, I walked to the balcony and pushed open the sliding door. The night air rushed in cool and damp, the rain slowing to a drizzle. I stepped outside barefoot, the concrete cold under my feet. From up there I could see the streetlights reflected in the wet pavement cars, hissing by people hurrying under umbrellas. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared down the city alive below me. The laughter from earlier still echoed faintly in my apartment. But out here the emptiness was louder. My voice whispered inside my head, steady and sharp. Some people choose to stay, and some people choose to leave. The truth of it settled heavy in my chest as the rain dripped from the edge of the balcony and disappeared into the dark. The phone rang early, the kind of ring that jolted me out of half sleep. I reached across the nightstand, my fingers clumsy, and pressed the screen to my ear. Ms. Carter. This is Wells Fargo Security. The man's voice was professional clipped. We've detected an attempted withdrawal of $15,000 from your savings account this morning. The login originated from an IP address registered in New Jersey. Can you confirm this was you? I sat up so fast the blanket slipped from my shoulders. My heart slammed against my ribs. No, I said, breathless. No, that wasn't me. I never authorized that. All right, he continued calmly. We blocked the transaction before it cleared, but I recommend you update your passwords immediately and set up fraud monitoring. We can email you the next steps. Yes, I whispered, my hand clutching the phone like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Please send me everything. When the call ended, the silence of my apartment closed in. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, then lowered it slowly to my lap. My pulse was still racing, my palms damp. David stirred beside me, his voice groggy. What's wrong? I couldn't answer right away. My throat felt like it had locked shut. I stood on shaky legs and walked into the living room, the early sunlight slanting across the floor. The cake box from my birthday still sat on the counter, stale now the frosting hardened. I pressed my hands against the cool surface of the table, trying to steady myself. David followed, hair tousled, still in his t-shirt. Emily. They tried to take it, I finally said, my voice breaking. $15,000. From my savings. His eyes widened. Who? I shook my head, but the answer burned inside me. The IP was from New Jersey. My voice cracked on the words. Who else would it be? For a moment, neither of us spoke. He crossed the room quickly and wrapped his arms around me, grounding me as the tremors in my body refused to stop. All those nights I whispered into his shoulder, all those shifts at the library, the coffee shop, studying until my eyes burned, saving every dollar. 4 years of my life poured into that account, and they tried to steal it like it was theirs. His grip tightened. I'm so sorry, Em. They can't get away with this. Not anymore. I pulled back, wiping at my face. It was my safety net, David. The one thing I thought they couldn't touch. I moved to the couch, collapsing into the cushions. My laptop sat on the coffee table. I opened it with shaking hands, logged into my account, and stared at the transaction log. The attempt glared back at me, red text screaming what I already knew. Origin. Newark, NJ. The numbers blurred through my tears. I dug my nails into my palm, forcing myself to focus, to breathe. But all I could hear was my father's voice echoing from years of dismissal. Don't make this dramatic. You owe this family. My chest burned. I pressed my fist against it as if that might keep it from breaking open. David sat next to me, watching. What are you going to do? The question hung in the air. I scrolled through my account again, checking every line, terrified there would be more. They didn't even ask, I muttered. Not that asking would make it okay. But they didn't even ask. They just tried to take it. David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. This isn't just family drama anymore. This is fraud, identity theft. You need to protect yourself. I closed the laptop and pressed my hands to my face. Images rushed in uninvited. My father's cold stare, my mother's tight smile, Sophie's smug laugh as she flipped through her phone. The photo of them at Disneyland. And now this, reaching into my account trying to rip away the only security I had left. It wasn't neglect anymore. It wasn't favoritism. It was theft. I dropped my hands, the anger finally bubbling up through the grief. They think I'm weak. They think I'll swallow this like I swallowed every other slight. But not this time. David nodded slowly. Then we fight back. I looked at him, my eyes raw, and for the first time in days, I felt something sharp clear alive. Yes, I said. We fight back. But even as the words left me, my gaze drifted to the bank statement still glowing on my laptop screen. My hands trembled, and deep inside beneath the anger, a colder truth whispered. If they could try to steal from me once, they would try again. I sat back against the couch, staring at the screen until the numbers blurred. The safety net I had built had turned into another weapon for them to use against me. My breath came shallow, each inhale scraping my throat. The betrayal was no longer just a feeling. It was a fact logged in digital ink. And I knew as the morning light crept further across the room that nothing would ever be the same. The call came in just after noon, my mother's name flashing across the screen in bold letters. I hesitated, thumb hovering, my stomach tightening as if it already knew what was waiting. Finally, I answered. Her voice rushed in, sharp and impatient. Emily, don't blow this out of proportion. It's just money. Sophie needs it to get her business off the ground. Families help each other. I gripped the phone tighter, the plastic edge digging into my palm. That's not just money. That's every night I worked late at the library. That's every shift at the coffee shop, every dollar I tucked away instead of spending. That's mine. There was a shuffle. Then my father's voice thundered through the line, deep and uncompromising. Don't talk to your mother like that. You wouldn't even have gotten where you are without us. Don't forget who paid the bills while you were growing up. You owe this family Emily. Always have, always will. My breath hitched, a flash of heat rising up my neck. I don't owe you theft. I don't owe you my future. Then came the sound I'd been dreading. Sophie, her voice trembling, thick with tears that didn't sound entirely real. Emily, please. If you don't help me, I'll lose everything. Do you really want to watch your own sister fail? Do you want me to drown while you stand there with your hands full of money? I pressed the phone harder to my ear, every sound colliding. My mother pleading, my father barking accusations, Sophie crying in desperate gasps. The voices overlapped until it felt like they were circling me, pulling me under. Stop! I snapped, my own voice shaking. Do you even hear yourselves? You didn't ask. You tried to take it. You tried to steal from me, and now you're calling it love. Don't be dramatic, my mother hissed. You've always had more than you need. Sophie is fragile. She has dreams. What do you have if not her? I almost laughed, the sound bitter and raw. What I have is the life I built without you. And you want to tear that down too. Sophie's sobs rose louder, so loud it distorted the speaker. You don't understand. Everyone is counting on me. If you cared about this family, you'd give me a chance. I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose, my hand trembling. The phone felt heavy hot, like it was burning into my skin. Emily. My father barked again, his tone final. A hammer striking steel. You are selfish. You always have been. This family made sacrifices for you, and this is how you repay us. By turning your back when we need you. Selfish. That word again. The one they had carved into me since I was a child, every time I wanted something for myself, every time I said no. It rang in my ears, cold and sharp, until it almost drowned out everything else. The room around me seemed to tilt. My chest heaved, but somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the guilt, something steadier pushed back. A single thought, clear and sharp as glass. They weren't asking me to help. They were demanding I surrender. I lowered the phone slightly, listening to the chaos of their voices spilling into the air, each one louder, more insistent. my father's rage, my mother's manipulation, Sophie's desperate performance. Together they had built this chorus my whole life, one I had danced to without question. But not now. I lifted the phone back to my ear, my voice firm, even though my hands shook. Enough. The word cut through their noise like a blade. For a moment they actually went silent. I am not your wallet. I said, my voice low, deliberate. I am not here to clean up your mess. Not anymore. The silence on the other end turned cold, jagged. My father's breathing grew heavier, the sound of his anger boiling. My mother muttered something under her breath, a curse or a sigh. Sophie's sobs faltered into hiccups. I didn't wait for their response. I hit the red button and ended the call. The sudden quiet was deafening. My chest heaved as if I'd run miles, the phone slipping from my fingers onto the couch cushion beside me. For a long moment I just sat there, my hands pressed against my face, the echoes of their voices still clawing at me. My body trembled, but inside, beneath the exhaustion, something shifted. A thin thread of strength, fragile but real, tugged at me. I pulled my hands away, staring at the phone lying face down. My reflection in the black screen looked back at me, eyes swollen, cheeks flushed, but not broken. The word selfish still lingered heavy and sharp, but this time it didn't sink like it used to. It floated hollow, stripped of its power. For the first time, I understood what I had always been to them. Not a daughter, not a sister, just a source. Just a wallet with legs. I drew in a shaky breath, my shoulders sagging, and whispered into the empty room. Not anymore. The weight of it settled final as the afternoon light stretched across the floorboards, painting long shadows through the blinds. The office smelled faintly of leather and polished wood, the kind of space designed to feel both heavy and safe. Bookshelves lined the walls, packed with thick volumes of law, their spines worn from years of use. Afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting soft gold against the dark oak furniture. I sat across from Daniel Harris, a man in his mid-40s with steady eyes, and a voice that carried authority even when it was quiet. My hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he'd offered, though the warmth did little to calm the cold in my chest. David sat close beside me, his knee brushing mine under the table. He leaned forward, watching Daniel sift through the stack of papers the bank had emailed over that morning. Each page looked heavier than the last. As he flipped through them, the crisp sound echoing in the stillness. Finally, Daniel set the folder down. He folded his hands on top of it, his gaze meeting mine. Emily, this isn't just a family dispute. This is identity theft. Under California Penal Code 530.5. Attempting to access your account without authorization is a crime. If we can tie this to your parents' devices, they could face heavy fines or even probation. Possibly worse if the court decides to make an example of it. The words landed like a punch. My breath caught and I gripped the coffee tighter, afraid I might drop it. But they're my parents, I said, the words trembling as they left me. I don't want to see them in court, let alone in jail. They're still... My voice trailed off. Daniel's expression didn't soften. Family or not, the law doesn't care. If a stranger did this, you'd already be filing charges without hesitation. They know you're vulnerable because of that hesitation. They're counting on it. I swallowed hard, staring down into the dark liquid swirling in my cup. My reflection warped across the surface. Tired eyes staring back at me. David reached across the space between us, his fingers curling around mine. They've already crossed a line, Em. This isn't about family anymore. It's about survival. You earned that money, every single dollar. It's yours. My eyes burned tears pressing at the edges. I can't stop hearing their voices, I whispered. My dad calling me selfish, my mom saying Sophie needs me, Sophie crying like her world is ending, and now this, taking from me and then twisting it into some kind of sacrifice I owe them. Daniel leaned back in his chair. You need to decide what matters more, their approval, which they've never given you, or your own safety. They've shown you who they are, Emily. The only question is whether you'll believe them. the words cut deeper than I expected because I knew they were true. I sat there for a long moment staring at the folder at the proof of what they'd tried to do. My fingers trembled against the mug. I thought of the nights I'd stayed up until dawn studying the shifts at the coffee shop where I stood until my legs ached, the library hours I traded for a paycheck barely big enough to matter. All of it added up to those savings. My safety net, my chance at freedom, and they had treated it like their pocket change. I set the mug down carefully, the porcelain clinking against the table. My voice was thin, almost fragile. What happens if I don't press charges? Daniel's jaw tightened. They'll try again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but if they think you'll let it slide, they'll keep pushing until there's nothing left to take. I've seen this before. Silence doesn't protect you. It encourages them. David squeezed my hand. He's right. You can't keep giving them pieces of you until there's nothing left. The room seemed to close in the walls, pressing tighter as the weight of choice settled on my shoulders. My heart ached with the thought of my father's fury, my mother's cold disappointment, Sophie's pleading sobs. But beneath the ache was something sharper, something that had been building for years, and finally had room to breathe. Resolve. I drew in a shaky breath, reached for the pen Daniel had placed beside the folder, and pulled the document toward me. My signature would authorize the bank to freeze and protect my accounts, to put fraud alerts in place, to treat any future attempt as criminal. The pen felt heavy in my hand, my wrist stiff as I hovered over the line. For a second, I saw my father's face scowling, telling me I'd regret this. My mother's eyes narrowing, calling me selfish. Sophie's tears streaming, insisting I was heartless. I lowered the pen and pressed it to the paper. The scratch of ink was loud final. My name sprawled across the line, black and unshakable. Daniel took the folder back, sliding it into his briefcase with a nod. "That's it," he said firmly. "Your accounts are secure now. If they try again, it triggers an automatic investigation. And Emily," his gaze softened just slightly. This was the right choice. My chest heaved as if I'd been holding my breath for years. I leaned back in the chair, my shoulders finally sagging. David brushed his thumb across my knuckles. "I'm proud of you." I blinked hard, swallowing down the lump in my throat. My voice trembled but steadied as I whispered, "This is the first time I've chosen the law over blood." The weight of it settled inside me as the golden afternoon light streamed across the desk, illuminating the space where my name had just been written. It felt like a line I couldn't erase, a boundary I couldn't step back from. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel powerless. I felt protected and terrified of what would come next. The steakhouse buzzed with the low murmur of conversations, the clink of silverware against plates, and the occasional burst of laughter from tables that weren't mine. The air smelled of seared meat and red wine, rich and heavy. A white tablecloth stretched between us like a barrier, my parents on one side, Sophie in the middle, and me alone on the other. Richard leaned forward, hands clasped like he was about to negotiate a deal at the bank. "We're here tonight for Sophie," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "This is about her future." Sophie's face lit with practiced confidence. She pulled a glossy folder from her oversized purse and set it on the table with a flourish. Embossed in gold foil was the logo Sophie Luxe. Inside were mock-ups of handbags, shoes, and dresses printed on high-quality cardstock. She slid the pages toward me as if she were unveiling treasure. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed. "Emily, all I need is $85,000. That's it. With your investment, you'll get 40% of the company. Think about it. We'd be partners. This is our chance to build something amazing together." I flipped through the designs, each one a jumble of trends I'd seen 100 times on Instagram. Bright colors, bold logos, nothing original. My eyes lingered not on the handbags, but on the numbers typed at the back. Costs, projections, timelines. All sloppy, inflated, naive. I set the folder down and reached into my bag. From it, I pulled a manila envelope stuffed with papers, sliding them across the table. "Do you know what these are?" My voice was calm, though my hands trembled under the cloth. Sophie's smile faltered. She looked down at the rejection letters from 3 major banks, each one stamped with phrases like high risk and lack of experience. I leaned in. 3 separate institutions reviewed your proposal. Not one of them was willing to risk their money. And you expect me to hand you nearly everything I've saved. The color drained from her face, replaced quickly by a flush of anger. Her voice pitched higher, shrill. Those bankers don't know vision when they see it. They're blind to creativity, to potential. I'm not asking them. I'm asking you. You're my sister. Before I could respond, my father's fist slammed against the table, rattling glasses of water. Don't you dare look down on her. Sophie has more talent in her little finger than you've ever had in your entire life. The diners at the next table turned eyebrows raised. I could feel their eyes pressing against me, strangers witnessing my humiliation. My mother's face crumpled, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. She reached across the table, her fingers clutching the napkin like it might anchor her. Emily, please, families are supposed to lift each other up. Sophie needs this. You can afford it. What's money compared to blood? Sophie's mascara had begun to smudge, streaks running down her cheeks as her voice cracked. Do you want me to fail? Do you want your own sister to collapse in front of the whole world? Is that what you want? Her words struck like arrows, but this time they didn't pierce. Instead, they sparked something steadier, harder. I sat straighter, my hands folding neatly in my lap. You're right, I said softly, my tone steady enough to cut through their noise. I don't want you to fail, but I won't be dragged down with you either. Sophie's sobs turned into gasps, her hands clutching the folder like it could save her. My father's face was red, now veins rising on his neck. Ungrateful, he spat. We gave you everything and you give nothing back. I felt the heat of every eye in the room on me, but for once I didn't shrink from it. I stood pushing my chair back. The scrape of its legs against the polished floor silenced the nearby tables. I placed both hands flat on the white linen, leaning forward just enough that my words carried. I am not your wallet. Not now. Not ever again. The air between us thickened. My mother's tears stopped midstream, her mouth opening in shock. Sophie froze her breath, hiccuping. My father's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hiss of a steak hitting a grill somewhere in the kitchen. Other diners tried to look away but couldn't. The scene had pulled them in, unwilling witnesses to the collapse of whatever image my family thought they projected. I gathered my bag, sliding the strap over my shoulder. My legs trembled, but I forced them steady. Without another word, I turned and walked through the dining room, past the curious stares, past the clinking glasses, and whispered commentary. The door opened to the cool night air, the city sounds spilling in to greet me. For a moment, I stood just outside, the weight of my words still vibrating in my chest. My heart pounded, my hands shook, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had claimed something that was mine. Behind me, through the glass, I could still see them. My father fuming. My mother crumpled in tears. Sophie's ruined makeup smeared like war paint. But their voices no longer reached me. I turned away and stepped into the night. Months passed before the storm finally broke. By then I had stopped checking Sophie's social media altogether, tired of the endless stream of filters and slogans she paraded as branding. But the world has a way of circling back, and one morning the headlines found me whether I wanted them or not. I was at my desk in the small co-working space I'd been renting in Manhattan, a mug of coffee cooling beside my laptop, when a notification lit up my phone. It was Leah, one of my co-workers. Her message short and sharp. Have you seen this? I opened the link, and there it was in black and white. The New York Times had run a feature by Linda Brooks, the headline, Bold and Merciless, the reckless ambition of Sophie Carter. When social media fame can't pay the bills. My breath caught as I scrolled through the article. On social media, Linda had laid everything bare: the extravagant launch parties Sophie had funded with borrowed money, the lines of credit she'd maxed out the unpaid vendors left chasing invoices. The words painted a picture I had already known was true, but seeing it in print for the world to consume was something else entirely. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as the coffee grew cold. Then TikTok made it worse. Or better. Clips started to go viral. People remixing Sophie's old videos where she bragged about building an empire spliced against footage of court filings and shuttered boutiques. One creator captioned it, "From Disneyland to bankruptcy," and the phrase caught fire. Within hours, the hashtag #SophieLuxFail was trending, racking up millions of views. I saw her face plastered everywhere, mascara streaming from a live video she had posted before deleting it, begging followers to support local creatives while commenters flooded with laughing emojis. But the image that landed the hardest wasn't on TikTok or Instagram. It came from a neighbor back in New Jersey. Someone had taken a shaky video of the Carter house, its once manicured lawn now patchy and overgrown, and in the front yard, staked deep into the soil, was a foreclosure sign. The camera zoomed in on it before panning back to the house blinds drawn tight, the curtains looking like they hadn't been washed in years. The neighbor's voice chuckled from behind the camera. Time to pay the price. The video spread just as quickly as the memes, and soon the Carter family wasn't just another household in Newark. They were a spectacle. I closed my laptop, pressing my fingertips against the cool metal. For a moment, I just sat there staring at nothing. My chest tightened, my eyes blurred, and tears welled up. Not from pity, not anymore, but from the strange, heavy weight of release. I had spent so long holding the ache of their choices, carrying it like it was mine. And now for the first time, I wasn't the one suffering the fallout. They were... I wiped at my face, quickly embarrassed even in the solitude of the office. Relief tasted unfamiliar, almost guilty, like I had stolen it. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was inevitability. I turned to the window. The city spread out before me, sunlight catching on glass towers, the streets below alive with movement. My reflection shimmered faintly against the pane, pale and tired, but steady. "This isn't revenge," I whispered under my breath, the words for me alone. "This is just the result of every choice they made." The thought sank deeper, calmer with each repetition. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension I had carried for years bleed out with it. For the first time in my life, I felt something close to peace. I rested my forehead lightly against the glass, my eyes on the horizon. And in that stillness, as the city pulsed beneath me, I realized I could breathe without the weight of them pressing on my chest. The first call came late on a Thursday night. My phone buzzed on the counter while I was washing dishes, the number flashing with my aunt's name. I dried my hands quickly and answered. Caroline's voice was uneven on the edge of breaking. "Emily. I can't take it anymore. Sophie came to me months ago, said she just needed a little help to get her brand off the ground. I gave her $20,000. $20,000, and now she won't even return my calls. She hasn't paid back a cent." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, the sound of water dripping into the sink filling the silence between us. I could picture her kitchen back in Jersey, the same faded curtains, the same cluttered fridge. But her voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it. She promised me it was safe. That you'd be investing too. She said everyone in the family would be behind her. Caroline sniffled. I believed her. And now the bank's on my back for the loan I co-signed. I swallowed, the bitterness rising. "I'm sorry, Aunt Caroline, but I never agreed to that. She lied to you." There was a pause and then a sharp intake of breath. "I know. I should have known." But Richard and Margaret backed her up every step. They swore she was their golden girl. And I thought, well, if her parents believe in her, maybe I should too. I was wrong. The line crackled, her voice breaking. "I don't know how I'm going to explain this to your uncle. I don't know how we'll crawl out of it." When the call ended, I stood frozen, the dish towel still in my hand, my reflection wavering in the kitchen window. The next morning, it was my Uncle Robert. His voice thundered through the phone before I could even say hello. This family is a disgrace. Do you know what your father and mother have done? They've bled everyone dry. Sophie came to me too. Tried to get me to front her money for her so-called luxury line. I told her no. But now I find out Caroline gave in and your parents stood right behind her lies. Uncle, I started but he barreled on. Richard has no shame. None. Margaret cries in front of everyone like she's the victim while Sophie runs around promising riches that don't exist. And you... His voice dipped lower-edged with disappointment. They said you refused to help her, that you had the money and turned your back. My chest tightened. I didn't refuse. I protected myself. They tried to steal from me, Uncle Robert. From my account. Do you understand that... The silence that followed was thick. Then he muttered, God help us all. The line went dead. It didn't stop there. A week later, there was a family gathering at my grandmother's house. Not a holiday, not a celebration, just a hastily called meeting that everyone knew was about Sophie. I hadn't planned to go, but curiosity pulled me through the door. The living room was crowded voices, clashing hands, waving everyone talking over one another. My parents sat stiff on the couch, Sophie beside them, with swollen eyes and a blotchy face. Caroline stood near the mantel, her voice breaking as she recounted how Sophie had taken her money. Robert paced near the window, shaking his head in disgust. The room split in two. A few cousins muttered that I should have helped, that if I'd given Sophie the money, none of this would have happened. Others sided with Caroline and Robert, their voices raised furious at my parents for defending Sophie after all the damage she'd caused. Then my grandmother's cane tapped sharply against the floor, silencing the room. Her voice was thin but cutting. Emily, she set her eyes on me. You are still part of this family. No matter what your parents have done, no matter what your sister has done, it is your duty to help. Blood is blood, and you have turned your back. Shame on you. I stared at her, the words heavy in the space between us. Around the room, eyes turned, some nodding in agreement, others looking away in discomfort. My throat ached, but I said nothing. Not one word. Inside, something shifted. The guilt that usually clawed at me was absent. Instead, there was only clarity. I looked around the room at the raised voices, at the way my parents clung to Sophie as though she were still their salvation, at the way my grandmother's scorn cut through reason. And I realized they couldn't see it. They couldn't see that the world outside already had. They were losing their grip, not just on me, but on everyone else. I folded my arms, leaned back in my chair, and let the noise swirl around me. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was a choice. In that moment, for the first time, I didn't feel the old weight of guilt pressing me down. I felt free. By 2025, the foggy mornings of San Francisco had become my new rhythm. I woke each day to the sound of the bay gulls and the low hum of the city stretching awake, and for the first time I didn't dread what the day might bring. Instead, I looked forward to it. Carter Advisory Group had started with just me, my laptop, and a rented desk in a co-working space. But in 2 years it had grown into a glass-walled office downtown, a small team of 6 bright analysts scribbling growth strategies across whiteboards, their voices alive with ideas. Charts and projections hung on the walls, markers squeaked against glossy surfaces, and the hum of phones and keyboards filled the air with a steady beat. On the whiteboard near my desk, someone had scrawled, Revenue Target 1.5. Year 1 achieved. The numbers glowed like a promise proof that everything I'd sacrificed had built something real. That afternoon, as I checked through quarterly reports, the receptionist poked her head in. Emily, you've got a visitor. When I stepped into the lobby, my heart lifted. Professor Helen White stood there, a familiar warmth in her eyes. She looked almost the same as she had the day she shook my hand at NYU, but maybe a little softer now, her hair streaked with more silver. Professor, I breathed, crossing the space to hug her. She laughed. Emily, look at you. CEO, founder, leader. I always knew you'd make something remarkable. She pulled back her eyes, scanning the office with genuine pride. You're the kind of story I tell my students now. You're the proof that resilience matters more than circumstance." Her words sank deep, soothing a part of me that had never quite healed. For years, I'd waited for recognition from my own parents, but here it was from someone who had seen me, who had believed in me when they didn't. We walked through the office, my team smiling politely, and I showed her the plans we were drawing up for expansion. She nodded, impressed, her hands folded behind her back. "Emily, you are the pride of Stern." The phrase hit me like sunlight after a storm. Pride, a word I'd never once heard from my own family's lips. My chest swelled with something that felt dangerously close to joy. That evening, the workday behind me, David suggested we go for a walk along the Embarcadero. The wind off the bay was sharp, carrying the salty tang of the ocean, but the city lights glittered against the water, reflecting like scattered stars. We stopped near the rail where the view of the Bay Bridge stretched wide and glowing. The waves lapped gently against the pier below, and people strolled past bundled in jackets, their laughter carried on the wind. David slipped his hands into his pocket, and when he turned back to me, he sank down on one knee. My breath caught the world narrowing to the velvet box. He opened the diamond inside, catching the city's light. His eyes locked on mine, steady and kind. "Emily," he said softly, "I know what it's like to feel alone, to feel like you have to fight every battle yourself. But I don't want you to ever feel that way again. I want you to know no matter what happens, you'll never be alone. Not as long as I'm here." The tears came before I could stop them. My chest tightened, my throat burning as I nodded, my voice breaking into a whisper. "Yes." He slid the ring onto my finger, his hand steady, while mine trembled. The cold metal warmed instantly against my skin, the stone glittering under the bridge lights. I pulled him up, throwing my arms around his neck, holding him close. His coat smelled of rain and soap, familiar and grounding. The rest of the city melted away. In that moment, pressed against him, I felt something I had never been given but had found for myself: family. I drew back slightly, looking at the ring sparkling on my hand, catching every fragment of light like it was holding pieces of my past and my future. My voice broke into the night air, steady but full of wonder. Family isn't where you're born. It's where you choose to stay. The bridge lights shimmered in the water as if they agreed. The living room glowed with the soft light of dozens of candles scattered across shelves and tables, their flickering flames mingling with the laughter of people I had come to trust. The scent of roasted chicken and garlic bread lingered in the air, mixing with the sweetness of wine. My 26th birthday, 2 years after that hollow night in New Jersey, had become something I never thought possible. Friends filled every corner of the space. Leah balancing a plate of food on her lap, Mark telling an exaggerated story that made the interns at Carter Advisory Group howl with laughter. Professor Helen sat comfortably near the window, her eyes crinkled in a smile as she listened to David's father joke about wedding planning. And David himself hovered near me, slipping an arm around my waist, steady and sure. I wore a simple white dress, nothing fancy, but the warmth I felt made me feel radiant. The apartment wasn't grand, but it pulsed with life. Every chair was taken, every glass full, every voice overlapping in a chorus of joy. When the knock at the door came, I turned, startled. David opened it to reveal 2 more colleagues, their arms laden with desserts. We didn't want to miss it, they chimed, and soon the kitchen counter overflowed with pies, cupcakes, and trays of cookies. As the evening deepened, the lights dimmed. Someone hushed the crowd, and a cake appeared, carried carefully by Leah. It was bigger than anything I'd ever had growing up, frosted in white with bold blue letters spelling "Happy Birthday, Emily." 26 candles flickered across the top, their glow bouncing off the faces around me. Voices rose together in song. Off-key, loud, cheerful. Nothing like the silence of that restaurant table years ago. My chest swelled. My eyes burned, and for once I didn't fight the tears. I smiled so wide my cheeks ached. "Make a wish," someone shouted as the song ended. I closed my eyes, inhaled the warmth of the room, and blew out the candles in one long breath. Smoke curled upward, vanishing into the golden light. My wish wasn't for them to love me anymore. It wasn't for my family back in New Jersey to finally see me. It was simpler than that. I wished for this moment to last, for the people here to remain, for the love I had found to keep growing. Applause erupted. Glasses clinked, laughter spilled louder than ever. Later, when the cake had been sliced and plates balanced in every hand, I lifted my glass. The chatter quieted, eyes turning toward me. My heart pounded, but this time it wasn't from fear. 2 years ago, I sat at a birthday table with 10 empty chairs. I thought the silence would swallow me. Tonight I stand here surrounded by people who chose to be here, who chose me. And that is more than I ever dared to hope for. I scanned the room. Faces glowing in candlelight, smiles, genuine hands raised in support. My voice wavered but grew stronger. Family isn't about who shares your blood. Family is about who stays, who shows up, who stands by you when it counts. I lost the family I was born into, but I found another one. And it's better. A wave of cheers rose. Glasses lifted high, the clatter of celebration filling the room. David kissed my temple, and Professor Helen dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. For a long time after, I just stood there soaking it in. The hum of voices, the sound of forks against plates, the warmth of laughter that wrapped around me like a blanket. It was everything I had once thought I'd never deserve. When the noise softened, and I found myself standing at the window with the city lights twinkling below, I let my thoughts settle. I spoke not to the room, but to the quiet inside me and maybe beyond. If you've ever been left behind on the day that mattered most, if you've ever sat at an empty table waiting for people who never came, I hope you know you're not alone. Tell your story, share it, because you might just find, like I did, that the family you thought you lost can be replaced by the one you choose. The reflection in the glass showed me smiling, the ring on my finger catching the candlelight, the laughter still alive behind me. For the first time, I felt the circle close.